which represents, again, these enlightened qualities, the same things that we want to develop in ourselves. So it's kind of that idea of praising or putting ourselves in a lower position to these beings. It's creating that opportunity for us to connect with them and to receive their blessings, their inspiration, their guidance. And then we'll do a second prayer that's all about what's called a mandala offering, which is really just simply making an offering to receive the teachings and again to receive blessings. And that offering is just a visualized the entire phenomenal world as just an amazing paradise, whatever that means to you. You can just do your own visualization. And then the third prayer that we're going to do is called refuge and bodhicitta. And refuge is the idea in Buddhism that whatever degree of faith we have in the Buddhist teachings, we bring that to mind, especially taking refuge in the Dharma, the teachings that the Buddha gave, as well as the Buddha who gave them, the spiritual community that practices those. And then the second part of that prayer is about this motivation that we'll also do a short meditation on. It's called bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is chitta, the mind, bodhi of awakening. So it's the idea that we want to awaken our deepest potential to be a benefit to all beings. And that's the gist of that prayer. So Jana is going to lead us in the prayers tonight, and I will put them on the screen, and we can all do those together. Thank you, Jana.
You're welcome. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, once in English. To the
founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the thought destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and offer refuge. Go.
Short mandala offering, once in English. This ground,
anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with mountain and root, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land.
Idam Guru Ratna Vada Refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for
refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha and Dharma in the spirit of liberty. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye
Chodam Soki Lobnam Damchu Vardu Lagni Kamsuchi Daki Chunyan Kipe Salanki Drola Venture Sangye Drupasho Sangye Chodam Soki Chodama Damchu Vardu Lagni Kamsuchi Dagi Chunyangi Pesanangi Drola Venture Sangye Drupasho. Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation. So I imagine most of you have some experience with meditation, but if you don't, just find a comfortable posture for the body with the back somewhat straight and upright. You can keep the eyelids open slightly if that's comfortable for you, or you can completely close the eyes, whatever you prefer. And just try to relax into this posture. Again, keeping that uprightness, but not becoming kind of rigid. What we're going to do is we're going to start with just a few minutes of focusing on the breath. So if you have a technique you already use with the breath, you're welcome to do that. If you need a suggestion, I might suggest tuning into the sensation that occurs around the nostrils. As you're breathing in and out through the nose, there's a very subtle sensation that occurs in that area. And just kind of tune into that, staying present with it as you inhale, as you exhale. But no doubt the mind will wander, and when we see that that has happened, there's no need for any judgment. We just acknowledge this is the nature of our minds. We do have distraction. We do get distracted by various thoughts or objects, sensations. And then return to the breath. Just let go of whatever it was that distracted you and return to your meditating on the breath. So we're going to do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection on this idea of bodhicitta, how we can be here with the best motivation to benefit all beings. So now we're going to generate a good motivation for being here. And the Buddha says that the thoughts that we introduce when we engage in these teachings or do any spiritual practice, or anything we do for that matter, those thoughts have a bearing on the results we get from our actions. So to get the best possible results from what we're doing here tonight, we want to generate the best possible motivation. We can start simply with examining our own individual, personal reasons for being here. Maybe this title of this course, Getting to Know Your Mind, this sounded like something that we might be able to use to have greater control over our thoughts, our way of being in the world. In that way, perhaps reducing some of the stress or anxiety that we have in our modern age. Maybe being able to be, kind of more pleasing for others as well as to be, more connected to them. We might also find that we're here seeking some sort of spiritual path, that something needs to change in our lives, that what we've been doing hasn't really gotten us the results that we seek. But there may be any other number of motivations that each of us has personally, and just take a moment to bring that to mind. Acknowledge in your own heart why you are here, what it is that you want to achieve from the time that we have together tonight, as well as this course. That's a perfectly fine place to start. But the Buddha says that all beings are fundamentally like us in having a desire to be happy and to not suffer. And if we look at whatever motivation brought us here tonight, it has something to do with that idea. Each of us trying to find happiness, trying to avoid what is unpleasant, what causes suffering. Every being is just like us in that way. And that's the starting point for the Buddhist teachings. We all start with that fundamental drive. And the Buddha says simply that we haven't been going about achieving those things in the best way. And because we are intimately connected with all beings, this idea of interdependence, interbeing, well, then our happiness depends upon others. Our freedom from suffering depends upon others. And theirs depends upon us. So when we sit down to engage in these sorts of teachings, it's best to have a motivation that includes all beings. While yes, we do want to work on ourselves, get to know our own minds, create the causes for our own happiness, we do that so that we can then benefit others. Those kind beings who have been involved in our welfare. We want to make sure that we have a motivation that includes them. And the most far-reaching motivation we can have is the wish to develop ourselves completely, to not just attain, some skills or a middling level of skills, but to attain the greatest possible level of capability so we can then benefit others, attaining the state of Buddhahood, so we can lead others to attaining that result as well. So whatever that means to you now, just this idea that you want to be here, to work on yourself, to be more capable, to help others. With that thought, we will create the causes, not just for our own welfare, but for the welfare of all beings. And just kind of hold that thought in your mind now. You can open your eyes fully. We'll begin. Is the light okay for everyone in here? With the overhead lights on, it's a little bright, but is it okay? So again, welcome. I don't know that, again, I don't know a number of you in the Gompa here tonight, as well as online, I think, but my name's Don Handrick. I've been teaching here almost 20 years, over 20 years now. Yeah, because I started coming up in 2005. I lived down in Santa Fe, and I was the resident teacher at the center down there. That's part of our organization that City Garba Group is a part of. So I was invited to do this class by the folks here. This is a class that I have taught once before. I've taught some of the other elements of it that I'll talk about in a moment, a couple of times. But this was a course that was specifically put together with the intention that Venerable Robina, who many of you know, this wonderful Australian nun who's in our tradition, she's been ordained as a nun for over 40 years now, I think. Anyway, she made the request to our center in Santa Fe that somebody teach this type of course. And I have to admit that this topic is the first topic that she taught to me exactly 30 years ago. So in January of 1996, when I was living in San Francisco, I started going to our center there, and she was doing a course that was essentially an introduction to these various elements of our mind, how we get to know our minds. And she was doing it in a somewhat bit more classical way, but nonetheless trying to make it extremely practical. And that's what she asked the center in Santa Fe to do. And so they talked to me, and I offered to do that. And so again, it was about 11 or 12 sessions of kind of going through all the various things that are more traditionally laid out in terms of the content of our minds. And I'll talk in a moment about what we mean by mind in Buddhism. It's a little different than perhaps the way Western science might look at mind or consciousness. But the idea is that we need to know what's going on in our minds if we are really to practice any form of spiritual path. Our thoughts, are the shirt that City Garbage Center put together last year, with our thoughts, we make the world. We're going to talk about this whole idea, how we experience the world, and even through the force of karma, how we do create our world, the things that we have an interaction with and so on, are products of our own minds. And our minds are really key in Buddhism. That's the workshop. That's where we really want to be attentive to. The external world, yes, pay attention to it in that it's a part of your experience, but changing the outside world doesn't fundamentally change what we're doing on the inside. On the inside is going to have a much deeper bearing and a more long-lasting bearing than what we do in changing the outside. So this is the whole idea behind this course and what we're going to be looking at in this. But I want to begin by introducing a quote from Lama Yeshe. Lama Yeshe was the founder of our organization. And I love this quote. It kind of puts us right in the ballpark of what we're doing here. He says, when you study Buddhism, and again, maybe some of you are just new to Buddhism, but we're going to be looking at Buddhist ideas and principles in this topic, in this course. You are studying yourself, the nature of your body, speech, and mind, with the main emphasis being on the nature of your mind and how it works in everyday life. Why is it so important to know the nature of your own mind? Since we all want happiness, enjoyment, peace, satisfaction, and since these things do not come from ice cream, but from wisdom and the mind, we have to understand what the mind is and how it works. Some of you may go, well, it does come from ice cream. We're not denying that there's some happiness we experience from the external world and there's suffering we experience from the external world. But all those things in the external world, it's created by our minds. Our minds are part and parcel of all of that. We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. Tonight's going to be a little bit more getting us in the ballpark and certainly understanding the fundamental teachings the Buddha gave and why mind is so central. But if we don't change our minds and instead we just keep focused on the external world, trying to get more and more ice cream, more and more of the fun, delicious stuff and avoid all the painful, awful stuff, we may be able to manipulate that for a while, but does it solve our fundamental problem? This is something that we're going to examine in the Buddha's very first teaching, on the teaching on the Four Noble Truths that we're going to touch on a little tonight. The Buddha essentially said that this is a mistaken idea, that all these things outside of ourselves are the source of our well-being or of our suffering. They play a role, definitely, but our minds are the main creators. So this is, again, basic Buddhist principle that we want to kind of adopt and work with as best as we can in the context of this, kind of use it as a hypothesis that everything comes from the mind. And we'll be exploring that and gaining more confidence in that idea. I want to mention that I did say that, yeah, Venerable Rabina, when she taught this back 30 years ago, she was rooting it primarily in what's come to be known as this topic of mind and cognition. The Tibetan for it is lorik. And it's actually taught in what we have here in our organization. Our organization is the FPMT. They have something called the basic program, but that's a bit of a misnomer. It's not basic in terms of introductory. It's basic in that it's more advanced studies that our spiritual guide, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, felt were really basic to our education, something we all need to know. I'm not going to teach it that way because we're going to touch on all the elements of it, but nonetheless, it's a much more structured and more classical, traditional way of approaching it. It encompasses two main areas. Buddhist epistemology, big word there, which is essentially how the mind knows. And there is going to be a little bit of that I talk about tonight. And it's something you're all going to be able to relate to. And this isn't like talking about something that's some really esoteric and what have you. It's just getting at how do we actually know things? This whole idea of knowledge and how we are interacting with the various things in our world and so on. That's part of it. But as I said, it's not going to be the main emphasis. The main emphasis for this course is Buddhist psychology, what the mind is knowing and how beings behave on the basis of their mental states. That is the real work that the Buddha wants us to do and that the Buddha did himself, that we can model and emulate and do that work and see what results we get from that. So, as I said, we'll touch on both of these topics in this course, but the first one really, mainly tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about Buddhist epistemology, but the main focus is on psychology, exploring its practical aspects in our everyday lives. If it becomes too heady or something, raise your hand or throw something at me, and I'll stop being very heady, and I'll try to make it more grounded in the practical. Buddhism is intended to be practical. There are a lot of philosophical studies that you can do. I studied for 7 years in Italy at the institute there, where they model the studies after what the monks and nuns study in the monasteries and that. And it's very complex stuff and wonderful to be exposed to. But you have to make that leap and make it very practical. You have to bring it back to, okay, what do all those teachings mean for me? no matter what I learn about the mind and all the various facets of the mind, how do I use them in my everyday life so that I actually behave better, or have better thoughts, know how to work with my mind to control it to some degree. Control is a weird word, but we can control things. We can actually have a greater impact on our thoughts and, of course, on how we relate to others. So that's really the key for this course. It's what I want to keep it at, is a level of practical advice. Tonight, I have to admit, is going to be a little more philosophical. I'll have a few bits that I'm throwing in there. The main text that we're going to use for this is one that I think is actually very approachable for all of you. And this is one that was sent out with the email this week. If you're not on the email list here, make sure that you do get on that. There is a drive where I put these materials. The main one that we're going to be using there is the first on the screen there, The World and Ourselves, Buddhist Psychology. It's by a monk in our tradition, Venerable Gyatso. He wrote this, I don't know when he wrote it, several years back, I think, 2008 or something. I don't remember the year, but it's available free of charge for everyone. And it's a wonderful little book that goes into some of the outside external elements that the Buddha talks about. And I'm going to skip over a lot of that, but mainly the inner world, the world of our minds, and these what are called mental factors, the various things. If you parse up the mind, what can you all find in there? What can you learn to work with? That book itself looks like this. This is the front cover and what have you. Again, it's a PDF file that you can use and go through and do some reading yourself. These are, by the way, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. Those of you who don't know, they were the founders of our organization. And that quote was from Lama Yeshe, who's on the right-hand side there. Lama Zopa Rinpoche kind of took over the organization after Lama Yeshe passed, and then Lama Zopa passed away about 3 years ago now. And so we're without a kind of key leader of our organization right now, but we're hoping that his reincarnation will be found soon. And anyway, that's another aside. Let's go back to my slides, and I'll get you grounded in what this text all presents. This is the contents of The World and Ourselves, that book I just introduced you to briefly. There is an introductory section, and I'm going to touch on that tonight. I'm going to touch a little bit on part one, the Buddhist world, because we do have to understand kind of the Buddha. He didn't come to like define the world or whatever, but he helped us to get an idea of what it is that is in our phenomenal world, which consciousness is an element of, as we'll see. The second part is a bit more of a philosophical investigation of what the Buddha says is our fundamental problem, this misconceived notion of self. I'm not going to touch on that anytime soon. That's going to be much further down the road. And it's kind of interesting that it's the second part of this. It really belongs in my mind much closer to the end, because it is a very, very detailed topic that becomes a little more challenging. But we're going to touch on it again in a way that I hope everyone can gain something from that. Part three, we will start with a little bit tonight, ways of knowing, and we'll continue that perhaps into next week. But this is Buddhist epistemology to some degree. How do we know? What are the ways that we know things? Because the Buddha says if our fundamental problem is a misconceived notion, is a mistaken idea, well, then the key is knowledge. The key is to know things as they really are, to understand things at a very deep level so that we can overcome what's at the root of all of our problems. So this is something I'm going to touch on a little bit tonight. Part four is where we're going to spend most of this course. And that's the disturbing emotions and how they arise, to kind of get to know these troublesome roommates that are hanging out with us in our mind, who we need to stop paying attention to and find ways of dismantling them and creating more loving and kind and nurturing roommates. That's how Venerable Rabina would often talk about this idea of all the contents of our mind. They're like, we need to get to know our crazy roommates, so that we have an idea when they're taking over. So introduction, I've just got a few pages here that I want to touch on, and how I'm going to conduct this. And I'm just going to read some small passages from Venerable Gyatso's book. And you're welcome, again, to read more of it. But as I said, some of it may go beyond what we're really going to discuss in this course. The most important section, once more, is that part four. When we get to that, and we'll even start that next week. So we're going to be spending most of our time with that. He has a section that's called, essentially on the relevance and importance of knowing your mind. We've touched on a little bit already, but let me go ahead and pull the text up, and we will take a look at the passages that I've highlighted there. All right, so let's go forward just a few pages here. Whoops, went too far. Okay. Was there any passage before that? Let me just make sure because I don't have my, oh, yeah, that's it. That's the first page of text in there. Can everybody read that? Maybe I need to make it a little bit larger.
It's small.
Let's see there. There, is that better?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. Sorry, to get it right in the center there. I think that'll be good. That's probably the largest I can take it, but okay, so Buddhism asserts that all troubles come from the disturbing emotions of anger, longing, desire, pride. He singled out these three, but we have many of these. We're going to get to know all of them, all these crazy roommates again, which in turn arise from what we call self-grasping ignorance, our universal innate misconception of how we exist as an individual person. Seems weird. Some of you in the room who've been studying Buddhism for a while might wonder, well, why is Don starting with this really heavy duty topic? Because this is a big one, but this is what the Buddha found. In the Buddha's investigation, he essentially found that every one of us is working with a mistaken idea of the self, the person, who we are. But in the deepest teachings the Buddha gave, he said we also have that misunderstanding with regard to everything else that we experience. We're going to be exploring that in more depth, but it essentially revolves around the idea that we tend to think that things are kind of creating themselves, existing from their own side. They're establishing themselves. And things don't have that way of existing at all. Everything in the end, I'll cut kind of to the chase just to get to how things actually exist. Everything in the end is established through the force of our minds. And we're going to look at this in a moment in terms of something as simple as the color blue that we all know and can relate to, and many of us are wearing and what have you. I'm not wearing blue tonight, but we have these things that we have been able to discern and know through the force of our mind, and that's really how they exist, is being posited through the force of our mind. The idea that things are sort of objectively out there on their own, or that we ourselves are some established, self-established unit, entity, these are mistaken ideas. And what happens is when we put all of our money on that and we think that this concrete self, pleasing it, taking care of it, protecting it is the most important thing in the world, we create our problems. We have the mind of anger that gets upset when other beings interfere with that. And we have the mind of craving desire that goes after the ice cream and all the other stuff that we love to just keep throwing at this self to please it. And it doesn't get us anywhere. In fact, it creates negative patterns that can result in unfortunate experiences through the force of what we call karma, that we're also going to touch on tonight. But the idea is this is what's going on for every being, the Buddha says. And just use this once more as a hypothesis. Those of you who might be new to Buddhism might have to work with this a while to really get to an understanding of what that means for yourself, much less what it means for all beings. But we're all like bumper cars going around with this intention of, finding our way to win the battle or whatever. And because we have this fundamental premise from the beginning that is faulty, everything we do on the basis of that tends to fall into that category. It causes us suffering. It causes others suffering. The world is all screwed up in a sense because we all have this fundamental ignorance. And take it as a hypothesis we can work with for a while. And when you come to understand that ignorance in more detail, perhaps it becomes a bit more relevant and tasty for yourself to look at your own mind and how that's happening. So, continuing here, Venerable Gyatso says, overwhelmed by this driving need to please and protect our wrongly conceived selves, we harm others and ourselves in pursuing what we want and in trying to avoid what we don't want. Never finding satisfaction, this is the very first teaching the Buddha gave. He said, this is the fundamental situation that we're in. He called this dukkha, this unsatisfactory state. We never find satisfaction. Lama Zopa Rinpoche used to quote the Rolling Stones. He would say, we can't get no satisfaction. And it's true, we can't find satisfaction. So never finding that, we tend to blame everyone and everything other than our own mind for our problems. This leads to alienation from friends and family, fewer opportunities to find happiness and peace, and our lives begin to appear meaningless. The only way to prevent or extract ourselves from the misery and sense of hopelessness in such self-created isolation is to combine wisdom, seeing how the self exists in reality, see how everything exists in reality, but particularly that person that we are so invested in, And, combine that with loving kindness, compassion, all of these wonderful qualities that help us to feel connection and meaning. And we have to have that towards everybody, especially those we have hurt in our selfishness. Who has access to our minds? Nobody but ourselves. And to stop our disturbing emotions and the resultant unhappiness, it is up to each of us to generate the courage and determination to train our mind in wisdom and loving kindness. The purpose of Buddhist teachings is to explain why this must be done and how to do it. So this is a nice little summary. I'm sharing some of this because I find Venerable Gyatso's words really quite on target. They're really hitting the mark. We often talk about these sort of two aspects of our path to awakening to our full potential that he was really mentioning, essentially. The wisdom side of it, he used the analogy of like a bird with two wings. If you have a one-winged bird, it doesn't have a very good shot at flying, right? It can never get to its destination. If we have both wings working in tandem, we can go wherever we want. This wing is the wing of wisdom, the wing that understands the fundamental truth that the Buddha taught that undermines this ignorance, that keeps that from being operative, that keeps us from following these same patterns that only lead to more and more dissatisfaction. So, we wake up and smell the coffee and we decide we're going to learn about this wisdom and actually incorporate that into our minds. And the Buddha taught a deeper level of wisdom that is this way of undermining that fundamental ignorance. But there's a lot of other wisdom teachings the Buddha gave us that help us to discern how things work within our conditioned world and so on as well. Principles of karma, principles around rebirth, and other aspects of our existence. That wisdom side is really essential because essentially the Buddha says that we are all ignorant of many things, but the most important one perhaps is our ignorance of our fundamental nature. On the other hand, if we kind of do that in isolation without really paying attention to this wing, then we don't get the full effect. We don't actually arrive at the full destination. We need this sort of, they call it the method side of the path, the compassion, the loving kindness, the understanding that within the view of this wisdom, that we're all interconnected, that nothing stands alone, independent, separate from anything else. Well, then we have to be attentive to the needs of all those beings around us. We have to have the loving kindness that wants them to be happy, wants to help them to have their happiness. We need the compassion that wants them to be free from suffering and wants to be an agent of helping them to be free from suffering. Because our own well-being is intimately tied up with the well-being of all others, we can't isolate ourselves and just be solely focused on our own welfare and expect that we're going to achieve this amazing result that we call Buddhahood. When you achieve Buddhahood, you've brought both of those to their full culmination. Your wisdom is fully developed so that you have this omniscient mind that knows all things. And your compassion and love is fully developed so that you act for the benefit of those beings. It's this wonderful saying from the Sutras of the Buddha. We had it last night in our class. I don't have the exact memorization of all of this, that the Buddhas don't wash away all of our negativities the way that you would wash dirt out of a cloth. They don't kind of remove your suffering in the way that would kind of pull a thorn out of your hand or something. They also can't take their realizations and plant them in the minds of other beings. So the question comes, okay, Buddhas can't do all those three things. Well, then how do they help sentient beings? They help by teaching the Dharma, teachings of the Buddha particularly that help us to overcome this ignorance, that help us to see that we're the creators of our own situation. We're the creators of our own suffering. And so that's how Buddhists teach us, and that's how Buddhists help us. We want to become a Buddha so we can help others in that same way, to be able to point out the truth to them, to show what it is that they need to realize at the deepest level so that they can achieve their potential. Another teaching I'll throw in here in this introductory talk is the idea of Buddha nature. What the Buddha says is we all have Buddha nature, all beings. And in our world of beings here that we are in, we have a lot of animals or those in that kind of animal species, all the way down to small organisms and what have you, to the largest beings that are in the animal kingdom. And we have human beings. And the Buddha said there are many other realms of existences that we don't see with the human eye. But all those beings have Buddha nature. They have the potential to become a Buddha. Well, why? Because they have a mind. And Tibetan, it's interesting. I don't know that much Tibetan. I'm not bragging about my Tibetan at all when I use Tibetan words, but I find it interesting. We use the term sentient being to refer to these varieties of beings like dogs and cats and whales and, lizards and humans and whatever. In Tibetan, they use the word semchen. Sem is the word for mind. Chen is possess. So they are mind possessors. That's a weird way of looking at beings, but they're all mind possessors. They all possess minds. Now, we were certainly not saying that the mind of an animal, like Zia here, who Stella brought in, her little dog, we're not saying that in that form, with that body, that Zia's mind has the ability to become a Buddha. Maybe. It's not very likely because we know a dog's mind is probably pretty obscured, but it still has that potential. And of course, in Buddhism, there's the concept of rebirth, that this mind that is together with that dog body right now has not always been in that dog body. It was in another body previous to this existence, and another previous to that, going back without any beginning. And it will continue to be with various bodies as long as it continues to take rebirth in this round of existence. But it can eventually achieve Buddhahood. It can eventually attain that state. Why? Simply because it has a mind. That mind in and of itself has the potential, the nature to become a Buddha's mind. It's a wonderful way of looking at things. I'm not putting down Catholicism in any way. I grew up Roman Catholic, but I didn't get these kind of positive messages when I was growing up. I got this idea that I was stained by original sin and that I needed somebody outside of me to, redeem me, to get me to some place of holiness or completeness, sacredness. In Buddhism, we all have that within ourselves. It's all there waiting to be exposed in a sense, waiting to come to its full fruition. The Buddhist path of developing wisdom and compassion is the means to help that to become our experience. You have it right now. You have the seeds of it, the potential for it, the Buddha nature. It can be developed into that state. So everything the Buddha taught, in essence, is to get sentient beings to achieving that state because that is said to be the apex of their experience. That is when you have no more suffering, nothing that is unsatisfactory. The mind is blissed out and always in that experience of complete well-being and happiness. And moreover, you're active in the world. You're helping others. You're appearing in the form of, qualified teachers and so on. Many of us hold His Holiness the Dalai Lama or other teachers we've had to be Buddhas appearing in this world to help us. Gets to be a little woo-woo at times, but nonetheless, this is how we will eventually help others, is by teaching them the Dharma, appearing in a form where they can learn from us. So going back, I've done a little long route here to get to this whole idea of what the potential of our minds is. This is an important part to understand around this whole course, though. All the work we do at any level to work with our minds, even just the real, basic stuff of just starting to get to know what's in our minds, is leading us in that direction, is leading us to develop our truest potential, to become the Buddha that we have as our sort of birthright. It's there naturally. It has been there since beginningless time. We've just been blind to it. Okay. So anyway, let's go back to the text and continue. I think there's another passage or two in this introductory section. Painful in their own nature, our destructive self-centered emotions hinder our pursuit of peace and happiness. They prevent our gaining any insight from life's vicissitudes, and through them we create causes for future misery. And this is this whole idea again, that when we follow many of these negative states of mind, we create the causes for our future experiences of misery, of suffering, in unfortunate states of existence, as well as just the things we have to experience even as human beings that are not so hot, right? Getting ill and aging and all these other things, right? So this is why they are our worst enemy. The flood of confusion and mental disturbance only abates when it is opposed by insight into the way we exist as individuals. Such wisdom diffuses the explosive potential of self-centered anger, desire, and pride, and opens the door to our being able to express genuine love and compassion, free from self-interest, and to willingly accept the responsibility of helping others to attain freedom from suffering and its causes. So that's speaking to that result of Buddhahood. This result of Buddhahood that we can, move in the direction of and eventually attain is where we will have that ability to have genuine love and compassion for others because there's nothing hindering it, nothing getting in the way of it, no anger towards any beings, no pride, no other disturbances. And we take the responsibility then to help others, to help them to achieve the freedom that we ourselves can attain. So this is, again, just speaking to the fact that we're going to spend a fair amount of this course. We're going to be looking at this whole thing, this list of, I'll introduce these to you mainly in the next class, what we call the mental factors. when we talk about mind, I'm going to get to the definition of mind. Mind is this experiential component of our being, right? It is something that is flowing moment from moment. Even when we go to sleep, it's said that our consciousness becomes subtler, but it is still flowing moment by moment. It doesn't go away. Even when we die, our consciousness doesn't cease when the body stops breathing and the heart stops beating. Instead, our consciousness goes on to another existence. Our consciousness can be parsed up into various aspects of it. This is what Buddhist psychology is all about, is kind of picking apart. Well, let's, through our thoughts, pick apart this part of the mind that serves a particular function and this part that does something else. Well, in looking at this, they come up with 51 mental factors. That's what we're going to be kind of examining in this, but the main body of them are what we call these disturbing emotions. Because the disturbing emotions are a bit hard to look at, but they're the troublemakers. Again, they're the crazy roommates that we need to be aware of when they're arising, and not keep giving them, foretime. We want to make sure that we address them and we do something different. What's interesting in Buddhist psychology, I'm going to do a little talk on this down at the center in Santa Fe a week from Sunday. Buddhist psychology, we in Western psychology, there is this idea of the pathology, the pathological aspects of our mind that are problematic. And they've not that recently, but fairly recently, begun to examine positive psychology, the more positive states of mind. And there's a little difference in the way Western psychology looks at that because they tend to think what we call positive psychology are all the stuff that makes us feel good. Positive emotions make you happy in the moment. Well, some of our positive emotions in Buddhism are about not necessarily feeling happy. They're about seeing things in reality. Compassion, for example, doesn't necessarily feel good to generate, but it's seeing the reality of suffering and being aware of that, being open to that, feeling suffering with another. All of those positive emotions that are set out in Buddhism are direct antidotes to some of the disturbing emotions. When you generate compassion and a high regard for others, loving kindness, and so on, you are antidoting. You are causing a force that will get rid of eventually your hatred, your anger towards others, your resentment of them, and so on. All of these they partner up. We have a negative, disturbing state of mind, and we counter it with the more positive states of mind. This is what Buddhist psychology is fundamentally about. We keep doing this, these become weaker and weaker and weaker. These become stronger and stronger and stronger. And eventually you annihilate those on this side of the equation. You don't have to experience those. In a sense, they are a choice. They're a thought. It's another thing that we're going to get into next week when we start introducing some of the things around mental factors. A lot of what we're going to talk about are actually thoughts. And I'm going to delineate what we mean by a thought versus just a sensory experience or some other experience. This is an important thing to understand, is that we are in this process of trying to kind of remove what is unhealthy, what's not causing us any, it's not giving us any happiness, it's causing us problems, and it's also causing problems for others. And we're going to replace it with a mind that can benefit both ourselves and others. So let's go back to the slides, because I think I'm pretty much done with that section. I want to share just one little quote from this incredible master, Indian Buddhist master who lived in the 8th century. And many of you have heard of him, Shantideva. He wrote a text called The Way of the Bodhisattva. And the very first chapter is all about this mind that we call bodhicitta, that we meditated on, that is the antidote to all of this in some sense. The wish to become a Buddha, to benefit others, to develop our own potential. In talking about beings, he says, for beings long to free themselves from misery, but misery itself they follow and pursue. They long for joy, but in their ignorance destroy it as they would their foe. This is Shantideva's observation, and was the Buddha's observation as well, that when we look at sentient beings, we see that the condition that they're in is that they don't want to suffer at all. They want to be free from misery, but they still go after the causes of misery. They still buy into the disturbing emotions and all the things that just keep perpetuating their suffering. On the other hand, they long for joy, for happiness. That's their fundamental drive, right? Any being. Look at insects, animals. They're all driven to get what will bring them happiness, what will provide comfort, some good feeling. But in their ignorance, they destroy it as they would their foe. They create the causes to actually overcome their happiness and not create the causes for that. They create the causes instead for more suffering. So we're going to be examining that in more detail too. But when we hear that, the first thing, of course, is to look at ourselves and say, this is a hard thing for me to admit, but I'm doing the same thing. I'm not always acting in my own self-interest, to the greatest degree. I'm often buying into these deluded states of mind that only lead to more suffering for myself. And I mess up and destroy any of the causes for happiness, even though I want to be happy just like anyone else. You have to see that that's where we start ourselves. But it also will break our hearts that this is what's going on for all the beings around us. The Buddha says our fundamental problem is ignorance. We do not know what we're doing. We don't understand the mechanism by which happiness can be created and suffering can be avoided. And that's what we're examining in this course. So, all right, let's go to the next slide where I give you, I think, pages for the next section. I want to introduce all of what I've talked about so far in the context of the Four Noble Truths, which many of you have had teachings on before. But again, just try to see it tonight in the context of what I've already been presenting, how this is really the Buddha in his very first teaching. They say the Buddha became enlightened at the age of 35, and he didn't teach for about 49 days. And then he remembered through the force of kind of this strong imprint of his compassion that he needed to really share these teachings with others, that what he had learned, that beings would be able to discern it. It might be difficult, but he decided he would start sharing the Dharma, the teachings. So it said that he went to Deer Park where there were these five ascetics, mendicants that he practiced with previously before he became a Buddha. And he gave them his very first teaching. I always am reminded that no matter how many people show up to any of our Dharma teachings, the Buddha only had five at his first teaching. So we sometimes get caught up in numbers that are centuries, but hey, the Buddha, five. Anyway, these five individuals showed up and he gave them this teaching called the Four Noble Truths Discourse. The Four Noble Truths set the structure for everything the Buddha taught in his entire 45-year teaching career. He taught till he was around 80 and then left this world, show that aspect of impermanence. But this is the most fundamental core teaching that the Buddha gave, teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So let's go ahead and look at a few passages on that. And there will be an opportunity for some questions. He uses the term here, Arya truth. We often say noble truth. It's the same word. Arya is a Sanskrit word that can mean noble, superior. It's usually referring to people who've had deeper insight. When we talk about Buddhist teachings, an Arya is one who has had the beginning of that deep wisdom that will help them to be free from other disturbing emotions and, attain their liberation, their enlightenment. So the Arya truth of suffering, it's often called. I sometimes like to use this Sanskrit word dukkha. Dukkha has a bigger connotation than what we have in English for the word suffering. But let's read what it says here. It says, all things that have karma and disturbing emotions as underlying conditions for their existence, sentient beings, their bodies, minds, and environments, are unsatisfactory or in the nature of dukkha, or suffering as it's often translated, which has three levels. Okay, so let's start there and come back and look at these three levels. This word dukkha, again, suffering works in some regard because once you understand it, then you can always translate it. But most people, if you ask them on the street, are you suffering? Might think, well, actually, I'm doing okay. I'm not really suffering. I've got, food on the table. I've got a roof over my head. I'm physically okay most of the time. They don't really think of themselves as suffering. But the Buddha says we're all dealing with dukkha. Dukkha is a fundamental state of dissatisfaction. The fact that all these things he pointed out, sentient beings, ourselves, our environment, our bodies, all of these things are contaminated. They're tainted by the causes of that dukkha. That's the second noble truth we'll get to in a moment. The first noble truth is simply saying, guess what, folks? It's really not okay, which is a hard message for us to hear again. I mean, these are a lot of the Buddha's messages were not easy to take in. And of course, when people use just the word suffering, well, then it's hard for people to relate, right? Because if I say I'm not suffering in the moment, then what does the Buddha have to teach me? Because I'm not really suffering. Well, let's look at these three levels that really define that we're in this unsatisfactory situation. The first one is pointed out here is the suffering of suffering, or the dukkha of suffering, pain. This is something that, again, we can, certainly see. It's the tip of the iceberg. It's physical pain, mental unhappiness, sickness, hunger, thirst. Not to say that we don't experience those things. It's just that at any moment in time, we might not feel that we are experiencing those, right? I'm okay. Today I'm all right, a little achy getting out of bed, but after I get stretched a little bit, I'm fine. So this is an important part of kind of recognizing the nature of our dukkha or this aspect of our experience, but it's not the whole thing. That's why, again, I tend to use dukkha instead of suffering. The second one, the dukkha of change, is actually what we call happiness. Ordinary happiness is inseparable from dukkha because when the conditions for pleasure or happiness inevitably cease, cannot be obtained, or are even indulged in to a greater degree than what we should, overindulging, we experience the pains of loss, craving, and exhaustion. Happiness is like a lighter degree of dukkha, as when we take an aspirin, and even though some pain remains, we say we feel good. So the idea here is that we have this experience of some suffering being reduced, ameliorated, through the force of something else, bringing us some pleasure. The example that we would often hear from our teacher in Italy, my teacher, Geshe Jampi Gyatso, we were studying in Italy about 10 miles from the Mediterranean coast. So once the weather got warm, of course, everybody wanted to go down and hang out at the beach when you had some time off from studying and what have you. So he would use the example of going to the beach. Now, we don't have a beach in New Mexico, but we can relate. I'm sure all of you have been on vacation somewhere. You arrive at the beach, and of course, you're pretty hot because you've trudged down to the beach or whatever, and it's been kind of a warm day. And so you can't wait to get in the water, right? You get into the water and you start to cool down, and it starts to feel really nice, right? But then you start getting goosebumps because the water's a little chilly, there's a little breeze. And so you get back into the sun and you lay in the sun for a while, and then you get too hot and you go back in the water, and then you get too cold and you go back in the sun, and then you get my message, what I'm trying to get across. Are those really true happiness? No, because all you're doing is you're trading one type of dukkha for another. The dukkha of being in the sun starts to become intolerable and becomes the first level of dukkha, the pain of the sun rays belting down on you, and you can't wait to get in the water because it's too hot. Once you get in the water, you've started the dukkha of the water being cold, right? And that coolness of the water eventually becomes intolerable, and you have to get back in the sun. And so we're doing this. We're calling this having fun at the beach, right? But are you really having fun? Is it true fun? Is it true happiness? Anything we experience in this conditioned world that we examine it through this lens that we call pleasure, that we call happiness, doesn't last in this way. And if we overindulge, it actually leads to that first form of dukkha, the suffering of pain, mental anguish, what have you. Think about it. I mean, this is a good, nice little analysis to do, over the next week or so. Really look at those things that you call happiness. Are they true sources of happiness? Now, that doesn't mean turn away from them all, never listen to, delightful music again, never eat delicious food again. It means you have a different understanding of it. You know that you're not going to put all your money on that because that's not leading to true happiness. It's not something that we can really invest in. And in fact, it often becomes a source of problems for us because of our minds and how we relate to those experiences, right? This is where we're going to talk about this delusion at some point, in this course. We call attachment desire, the craving and grasping for all those delicious, delightful things. They don't really produce the result that we seek. Okay. The third level of dukkha is the one that we have to struggle with perhaps a bit, and that's the fact that we're in a condition existence that is unsatisfactory by its very nature because we're under the control of certain causes. It's called here pervading dukkha or pervading suffering, the unhappiness of always being under the control of karma and disturbing emotions. No matter how well off we think we are, our bodies and minds always have the potential to give rise to suffering, either now or in the future. And we can say that either the other two types of dukkha can arise on the basis of having this body that is conditioned in this way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. This is referring to the fact that these two terms were mentioned here, karma and disturbing emotions. That's going to be the subject for the second noble truth. The first noble truth is like the Buddha being a doctor saying, I hate to tell you this, but you're actually not well. You're actually dealing with a condition that is unsatisfactory. You go, okay, yeah, why is that? And second noble truth, because within your own mental continuum are these disturbing emotions, this term I used earlier tonight, that is referring to all the ways that we have distorted reality and that we are acting from an unhealthy, faulty place, and the karma, the mental energy that creates these various experiences. Karma is a tough word in our English language to really get our heads around. We use it a lot in colloquial language, but we don't really have a good definition of it when we use it in that way. We tend to think it always means something negative. Oh, that's their karma when we see somebody who did something negative, suffering or something. Karma is the creator of all of our experiences, good, bad, or indifferent. The mental energy we have that starts with disturbing emotions, or it can start with healthier emotions, brings forth a particular movement of the mind that causes us to sometimes do things physically or say things, or even just have stronger thoughts that create seeds that we experience. This is the process by which we are in this human existence. We are in what we call cyclic existence, samsara. It is the process by which all of this is here, is through the force of our own minds. We are creating these experiences in what we call samsara. Samsara is a term that, again, is just referring to cycling from life to life. So this is, I put together a little graphic for this that I have in my chart. I don't know how effective it is. Sometimes it works. It's called the tree of samsara. So when we talk about these factors that I just touched on here already in terms of ignorance, the disturbing emotions, or unwholesome thoughts, what have you, and then the karma we create in our experiences, they are all parts of the tree. And this is all going to be contained within the tree. And we experience only what's in the tree as long as all these factors are in place, particularly number one at the bottom, which is the root of the tree. The root of the tree is, again, this ignorance that clings to this I, this self, this person that we ourselves are, and all phenomena really, to be truly or inherently existent. That's another language that we sometimes use to refer to this false idea that this I sets itself up, that it has its own existence, that it exists independently. And we do that with regard to everything we come into contact with. When that root of ignorance is operating, we only get results within the tree of samsara, because it's the root of the whole thing. Number two, the trunk of the tree, I'm using that as an analogy for the thoughts that we have that are cultivated within that ignorance. We can have positive, wholesome thoughts. Definitely, we do. Every day we have them, I hope. Right? Thoughts of compassion, care, concern, love, what have you, all these really wonderful thoughts. And those produce some, good karma that we have good fruits from. But the unwholesome thoughts, unfortunately, are also rising because our ignorance is often feeding some of that as well. And that's, again, what we're going to be looking at in this course is how do we identify those things? How do we be aware when they're arising? How do we do something counter to them? So those two types of thoughts, and we can even say also we have neutral thoughts. During our day, we have neutral thoughts as well. But neutral experiences and neutral thoughts, I usually don't include them in this because they're not so important. We're mainly involved in these two poles between what's beneficial and helpful and what's, harmful to us and to others. On the basis of those thoughts, which in a sense are karma themselves, they are a mental energy we are creating, but we often engage in actions. Karma literally means action. Those are virtuous and non-virtuous things that we create with our respective thoughts. It's hard to, again, to describe what we mean by karma. Karma is kind of energy. It is a mental energy that can sometimes manifest in what we say and what we do through our bodies. Physical or verbal actions are included in karma, but everything starts with the mind. Our body just doesn't do things without our mind being involved. Well, I guess your speech sometimes can happen with Tourette's or something, and you're not really consciously making choices to say those things. But in general, for most of us, our bodies and speech follow the mind. The mind is the creator of all of our karma. Karma and mind are intimately connected, right? So we create karma, these actions that are essentially giving forth the fruits. And they don't give those fruits immediately. They give those fruits over time. They're the happiness and suffering that we experience from our karma. This is just a little schema that I think, maybe demonstrates to some degree this causal process that the Buddha is talking about in these first two truths. The first truth being, once more, this truth of dukkha. It's identified mainly as the fruits that we experience from the tree. The causes of dukkha, the sources, as he uses the term here, is the disturbing emotions, unwholesome thoughts, and so on, as well as even some of our wholesome, that give rise to our karma that only produce results within the tree of samsara. Good results, bad results, but we're still stuck in the tree of samsara. As it says there in that second line, our confused actions place latent potencies upon our mind streams that have the capacity to ripen and connect us with dukkha experiences in this and future lives. The disturbing emotions are agitating by nature, and and so on. Anyway, the idea is that this is what our fundamental situation is. The Buddha in the First Noble Truths, as a doctor, was saying, guess what? We're not well. And secondly, the causes of your illness are within yourself. In our culture, again, we tend to get very focused on blaming everything outside of ourselves. If only that person could go away, or if only this thing were different, then I'd be happy. But all of those things are creation of your mind to begin with. And you are not going to simply be able to achieve any real lasting peace or happiness by changing those things, because they too are impermanent and they will change over time. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in. The last two truths are the Buddha's way of saying, guess what, folks? It doesn't have to be this way. I always joke that if the Buddha just gave us the first two truths and then said, that's your situation, good luck with it, let me know how it works out for you, and, said toodaloo, well, then it wouldn't be very compassionate, certainly, but, wouldn't be wise either. The Buddha, in his wisdom, saw that there are the third and the fourth noble truths, that there can be an end, a cessation of dukkha, and all the causes of dukkha. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the reading here on that, but that essentially comes about, sorry, it's key here, that comes about when we have realized the wisdom at the deepest level that overcomes that root of ignorance. Once you uproot the tree cannot survive. And then the true paths that lead to the cessation of that dukkha. And what we're essentially learning in this part of this course is the path of working with our minds, the path of addressing our disturbing emotions and accentuating our positive ones so that we can actually attain some freedom from this process. And if you can't attain the freedom from this process, in this life, you at least will be able to attain a little bit more peace of mind, because you're not going to be continually following those agitated states of mind. And that's, again, the main gist of what I want to cover in this course as well. But it is important to understand this context of the Four Noble Truths, because that's everything the Buddha taught was in the context of that. Essentially giving us varied tools, various ways, what we call paths. And path doesn't mean a physical path through the woods or something, but it's very evocative of that. It's something to help us get to our destination. It's a consciousness that we can generate that will help us to arrive where we want to go. So this is what we're aiming for and working with in these teachings, is to explore the Buddhist path that will lead to an ability to overcome these habitual patterns that are bringing us suffering and to attain those that will bring us peace. Now, there's a whole section on the divisions of existence or phenomena that I'm going to kind of skip over. Essentially, what he says in that section is that I don't think it's quite as dualistic as some of like Descartes and what have you in Western philosophy of the dualism of body and mind. But nonetheless, body or physical things, our body and all the physical matter and forms and so on that exist in the world, and mind are unique phenomena. And there's even a third category that's kind of neither of those. But let's focus on these two to begin with. Physical matter has its own continuity, right? Let's just look at our own experience. Where does your body come from? I mean, yes, it's influenced by the mind you had that planted karmic seeds that caused you to have a human body. But the actual causes of your body are what? Two physical cells that come from your parent. The sperm cell from your father that fertilized the egg cell of your mother, and in the womb of your mother that grew into the body that you have the continuity of right now. Of course, all the cells that were there then are completely gone, been replaced many, many times by other cells and so on. There's that continuity that began at that point that is a unique continuity compared to the mind. The mind is a non-material phenomenon in Buddhism. Now, Western scientists who are materialists will say, no. Mind is emerging from all this physical stuff on the basis of electrochemical synapses and all this stuff happening. That's what we mean by consciousness. Of course, the implications of that are that when all of that stuff stops at death and you no longer have all that happening, well, then mind ceases. But Buddhism says mind has its own continuity because mind is, get to the definition shortly and can show it to you according to Venerable Gyatso's text. But he says essentially it has the nature of clarity, meaning that it is non-material. It doesn't have a single atom of physicality to it. And secondly, it has the function of knowing. It is the nature of our experience to know things. So essentially, we have this other phenomenon that depends upon its own causes and conditions. Our body depends upon those two, cells that became the stuff from which this body was produced, as well as all the other stuff that happened while we were gestating in the mother's womb until we were born and having to continue to eat and exercise and all the various things that have contributed to this body being here. But the two cells that united in the womb of our mother were the substantial cause of this body. Well, you need a substantial cause for the mind too. And it can't be physical because the mind isn't physical. So essentially, what we're dealing with when we start talking about mind is something that has a unique continuum compared to what we call form or matter. And again, they're not Descartesian other, than each other and unrelated. They're very much related, as we've already seen, right? Mind creates our world. Through the force of our karma, we have these bodies in this physical experience. Nonetheless, that physical stuff does still have its own physical continuity. Anyway, just a little bit on that. I don't want to go into too great a detail because it's not as relevant to what I want to do in this course as looking at mind. So you will see when you get into that section, 18 through 19, sorry if I'm making anybody dizzy by doing this, that you have this idea of things that exist being known by mind and so on. I highlighted a few passages thinking I might go into them, but I think it's best. There's forms, consciousness, products that are neither form. And then he goes into a whole thing around, various realms of existence and that. You can read through that if you wish, but that's not my main interest in this course. I really want to focus on mind and what mind is and how do we work with our mind. So going then back to the slide, we see that there is a second section that I want to allude to, which is the nature of mind, which is pages 21 and 22. I've already touched on it a little bit, but let me go ahead and go there, and we don't have much more time tonight. We have a little bit of time, and I want to, again, open it up to some questions. This is at least to kind of once more get us in the ballpark of what we're talking about here. So 21, what is mind? Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I meant to hit that other, okay. In Buddhism, mind is asserted to be the mere experience of things, either through the five senses or through thought. The domain of our mental consciousness is thought. We don't think in our sensory consciousnesses. They experience things differently. This is something I want to touch on if we have time yet tonight. Mind is not some esoteric substance in the background that does the experiencing. It is the very experience itself. Our experience of things includes whatever subjective feeling of happiness or unhappiness, or emotion, love, anger, generosity, greed, and so on, that accompanies our awareness. We have a very broad range of things that are a part of what we call our experience of our mind, and that's what we're going to be investigating. As it is simply the experience of things, mind is not a physical entity. Even though our mind depends upon a functioning brain and nervous system in this human life, experience itself has no material properties such as color, shape, texture, and so on, nor is it any of the physiological processes or organs upon which awareness depends. Thus, the human organism consists of a duality of body and mind that are interdependent, but yet different entities. This is, in a nutshell, the whole Buddhist view of what we mean by mind. We are not talking about this, again, kind of emergent property from all of the stuff going on that is happening in the brain, the central nervous system, and what have you. We're talking about something that has its own distinct continuity that is together with this body while we have this body. And once more, we'll go on and have some continuity of it after this life ends. When this body ceases to function, the consciousness will leave this body. And there's whole teachings that the Buddha gave around that process and what occurs at death. It's really quite interesting. We'll talk about that in this course. But so this is what we mean by mind. And why it's important to attend to the mind once more is because we are experiencing the results of what the mind did in the past. And what we are doing with our mind now will be dictating the experiences that we will have in the future. They often say that, these great Tibetan teachers I've had, if you want to know what your past lives were like, look at the nature of your life right now, what you are experiencing. If you want to know what your future lives are going to look like, look at what you're doing with your mind right now. And this is really getting at the crux of what I want to encourage you to do as you go through this course, which is to take these teachings and begin to see if you can, apply them in your life now so that you can begin to shape your future experiences. Now, karma isn't John Lennon saying about instant karma, right? But karma is not so instant. Karma generally takes much more time for it to ripen. But we should be able to see to some effect some difference in our minds as we apply these principles, as we begin to subscribe to inducing more positive states and eliminating negative ones. We should become happier individuals. And I think most people who practice Buddhism will say that that's occurred to some degree. We even have some people who are Buddhist practitioners who have great suffering in their life at some point. Really horrible things happen, ripening of something that they're having to experience. But they have some peace in their mind in spite of all that they probably would not have had if it wasn't for some of the training and these ideas. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, this is what I can't promise. There's no guarantees with this course. But nonetheless, if you do engage in these teachings with some wholehearted, concerted effort, you probably will see some change in terms of how you live your life and a sort of change in your relationship with what you are experiencing. Because once more, if we use that lens of what I'm experiencing now, I created in the past, well, then what I'm experiencing now becomes a very valuable lesson in what I did in the past that I want to avoid in the future if I don't want to continue to experience that. Most of you know Pema Chodron, a wonderful Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and she's written incredible books. I think she's an amazing, amazing teacher. She frames karma this way. She says, karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. So when we have things come into our life that are the product of what we did in the past, well, rather than creating the same pattern again in relation to that got us in trouble in the first place, we should look at this and say, oh, what does this have to teach me? How can I learn from this? If I've got annoying relative in my life right now, well, guess what? That's your annoying relative. You created it through your patterns of inducing that type of experience, that appearance of this being that's going to annoy you now. Well, how did you get into that situation? By making that situation worse. Every time that you do the same thing over and over again, it just creates the pattern to experience it over and over again. Another phrase we have in the Western language, I don't remember who, I heard it attributed to Ben Franklin, but I don't know who really said it, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, guess what, folks? We're insane. We've been doing the same thing over and over again. Every time we have that experience come into our life that we created through a negative behavior back here, we do the same negative behavior. And we think somehow it's going to be better. No, we're not even necessarily aware of what we did here. But the point is that as long as we keep doing this, we're never going to be free of those things. You're never going to change your experience unless you start changing your mind. That goes back to that verse from Shantideva, right? This is what we're all doing. We don't want to experience this suffering in the moment, but we keep creating the causes for it. And we want joy and happiness in the moment, but we keep fleeing the causes of that. We keep moving in the opposite direction. So the Buddhist teachings are to tell us that we need to move in the right direction. We need to actually do what will be more beneficial. Let's go back and look at, there's another passage or two, I think, from this section on what is mind. Just kind of highlighted some of these. Maybe I didn't. It's going off in. Anyway, maybe I'll open it up to questions at this point. We've got 15 minutes. And I did want to talk a little bit about sense consciousness and mental consciousness. Let me open it up to questions first. Any questions here in the Gompa or online? It's online who are listening. Yes, please, Anne.
So, we have good and bad experiences and bad experiences, and that's all in our mind. Now, how can you fix your mind? I mean, we know that we're creating the bad experiences, right? We can know that.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you change your mind so that those bad experiences don't recur in the future?
That's what we're going to be examining in this course. So let me use an example, okay? So say that you have annoying people in your life. Does anyone have annoying people in their life? Raise your hand. Those annoying people are a product of your having been annoying in the past towards other people. It's your experience can come back. Again, karma isn't that simple. I don't want to make it sound really linear because that's not the full dimension of karma. We'll go into this a little bit in this course, but not, this isn't a whole course on karma. This is just to understand the basic mechanics. You've created through your own past behavior that was negative towards others, other negative people coming into your life. If you change your thoughts at that time and your behavior towards that negative person, if instead this annoying person comes at you and they're insulting you and doing all sorts of things towards you, and you think about them through the lens of compassion, if you look at them and you say, there's this being, I know I created this through my own past actions by being annoying and awful in response to this sort of thing. Instead, I'm going to have compassion for this being. I'm going to look at this being through that lens and generate more positive thoughts of wanting them to be free from their suffering and from these disturbing emotions they're having and to find the peace that they seek and generate loving kindness and all these amazing thoughts towards them. You create a whole different karma because you're not creating the karma that got you into that situation in the first place. So you're not recreating it. And instead, you're using it as a doorway to create more positive thinking, more positive thoughts. Those thoughts they're the seeds you want to be planting, the wholesome thoughts that give rise to positive karma that create good experiences in the future. And when you do them with deeper motivation, they can create the causes to be free of the tree of samsara once and for all and to attain Buddhahood. So again, all of these can move us in a different direction, but we have to make a concerted effort to choose to look at things differently. That's why we do often talk about how essentially sentient beings, as we saw in that second noble truth, they're under the control of their disturbing thoughts and their karma. And most beings, that's the case. That's what's controlling things. Because karma even causes us to have similar thoughts. Why do many people we know might say, oh, I'm just an angry person. That's just who I am. Why do they see themselves as an angry person, experience themselves as an angry person? Because they keep creating the causes for that anger to arise. That's one way karma actually manifests in our lives. It causes us to have certain thought patterns. It takes a lot to break out of that. This course is like getting us into the arena of trying to work with this. And many of you who've been working with Buddhism have been doing this work, where you have to introduce different thoughts. You have to be in control, not those past patterns and past thoughts and how they've been ripening in your life that cause you to continue to do the same things over and over again. And it works. I mean, when you do start becoming more familiar with those positive states of mind, they become because the karma works there too. As I said, karma is a principle that is manifesting in any of these ways. Here, it will happen that you will be more familiar with compassion. Whenever you see a being, regardless of what they're doing, they might be killing another being. You'll have compassion for them as well as the person being killed.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a big.
It's a big ask.
Big ask.
Yes, there's a question up there. Remind me of your name again. I think I met you. Laurel, that's right. I remember now. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued, and I'm wondering about the causation of, I say, like out picturing of my own mind. I'm getting the result of my thinking. So is there a premise that kind of can cut through and go, okay, if I'm doing that, the guilt or remorse or whatever, I want to change my mind, but attacking myself for making a world of attack, suffering, doesn't change it fundamentally. Like that, so the basic goodness that I would give, I also have to be willing to step out of the guilt that I put on myself, because in a fundamental way, if I'm trying to earn goodness by forgiving one thing at a time, it'll be infinite in a way. I mean,
yeah, as I just started talking about, Laurel, is the idea that, again, we're doing multiple things here, certainly. We do have a strongly ingrained pattern for certain things to arise. I'm sorry I didn't repeat Laurel's question or comment for everyone online, but it was essentially dealing with this idea that we might fall into patterns of guilt and whatever that we keep throwing at ourselves, and in the midst of this trying to increase that more positive thinking and kindness and generosity and what have you. But these two things, they do have a relationship to each other. Again, as I was pointing out in Buddhist psychology, the tendency for us to fall into those negative states is there. Absolutely, with most of us. Again, if you've done prior training in other lives, then maybe you come into this life with a bit more of a proclivity to being compassionate and kind right from the get-go. But for most of us, we are having these states of mind arise, and we're being self-critical, and we're feeling guilt, and we're feeling horrible, and we're doing all these negative things to others that are harming them as well. And they can be overcome when we adopt more wholesome ways of being, which we do have to become familiar with. That's another part of the Buddha's process, is that it's not just saying, okay, I'm going to choose this versus this. You have to know what you're choosing over here and have this really have some force to it, some weight to it. That's what meditation is all about. And I really encourage people, if you're not doing meditation yet, to adopt some of this. And there will be an introductory meditation course coming up here very soon in Taos that'll be run that you can attend if you haven't gotten meditation instruction. The word gom, John mentioned earlier that we call this gompa. Gompa means a place of meditation. But the word meditation or gom itself has the connotation of becoming familiar. Becoming familiar with what? With these positive states of mind, with the things that we can then introduce more easily. It's going to be a struggle. Absolutely, Laurel. We're going to have the mind going in these patterns that are just, it's so habituated to do, where we will feel a lot of self-denigration and guilt and whatever else, all these things, as well as spitting that out towards others in terms of resentment and spite and what have you. To produce the force over here that will be able to overcome that does take some familiarity. It does mean that we have to get in there and cultivate these states of mind. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be introducing as well. Is we're going to talk about the virtuous states of mind. Those are part of these mental factors I mentioned earlier, because those are how we induce the positive states, that antidote, that act in opposition to the negative ones. So hang in there. And again, the very first step in all of this that I want to remind everyone is becoming cognizant of what's going on. That you don't necessarily have to be in the driver's seat and making different decisions at this juncture. If you're fairly new to these ideas, you're simply becoming aware of, this is what's happening. My mind creates these experiences, and then how I react to them in that moment can perpetuate all of that. Versus if I respond more healthfully, more, from a more wholesome angle, then I can change that. It's kind of interesting. When I made a comment when I first started teaching Dharma, I made the comment that this whole teaching on like karma and cause and effect is to teach us that we need to get out of the back seat and get in the front seat and be the driver. And then I thought about it and I said, no, the teachings on karma are actually that we've been the driver all along. We just didn't really know how to drive. We weren't even sure what we were doing. We were just going along and making a lot of mistakes. We are always the driver. Even though we say we're under the control of all these factors, you're still the driver. You are the one making the decisions about what you want to experience and how you frame what you experience. And that can be done in every single moment when we've generated some force to it. That's, again, part of the process. Mary Jo, and then we'll go to you. Just one second.
I was going to tell you, Mary.
Oh, Mary Jo.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have the computer screen in front of me. I know she's had her little yellow hand up there for a while. Please, Mary Jo.
My little hand.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
So even if you're able to take care of sort of daily best decisions and so forth, but isn't there sometimes also this karma from other lives? And that can be really altering our life. Is that correct?
I mean, it is correct in that we have no certainty that at any moment the whole thing isn't going to fall apart. I mean, this is one of the things we even talk about in regard to death, much less, other karmic occurrences where suddenly things have changed for us, such as getting a grave illness or having, some huge shift in our lives. That's the nature of existence, right? Is that we are, yes, under the control still to some degree of karma we've created in the past that can ripen due to causes and conditions at any time. But what we're mainly trying to do here is to then look at, but then how do I work with my mind regardless of what's happening here? Because the tendency that we have, once more, is when things go really well. Of course, that's our default, right? We think everything is supposed to go well. That's the Venerable Rabin often talks about this, how she gets all these questions about, well, what happens when things go bad? There's even that book, right? What when bad things happen to good people? Like this is such a puzzle. Everyone's supposed to be kind of good from the very beginning. We're all born innocent and what have you. And it's natural for us to all have wonderful things in our lives. And when things go bad, suddenly it's a problem. No, when things go good, that's karma ripening. When things go bad, that's karma ripening. When things are neutral, that's karma ripening. It's all part of the same process. So whenever the karma shifts and suddenly we're dealing with a different landscape, and oh my gosh, I've got an illness that could be terminal for me, and I've got to contend with that and be dealing with that landscape. If I work with my mind, then I have the tool to do that. Whereas the tendency is when everything's going good, we're way up here. Lama Yeshe said we're like yo-yos. Then when everything goes bad, we're way down here. And we get bent out of shape, and the negative stuff, and they're elated at the happy stuff, and we just keep going up and down like this. Well, what is it like to be even keeled through all of this? All the good stuff happens and you don't get really attached to it. You kind of go, it's all impermanent. It's fleeting. I can enjoy this meal while I'm partaking of it, but I'm not going to grasp at it and think it's going to last forever and all these mistaken ideas. And when things are not so good, I get served a lousy meal or something and have to contend with that. I'm not going to be so averse to it and angry and upset because this is just the nature of existence. Things are not always in one category or the other. For most of us, they're floating between these throughout the course of a day, even sometimes minutes, right? We're elated, and then all of a sudden we get a phone call or a message or something, and it's way down in the dumps. Don't let our minds get bent out of shape by these things, but find a way to work with them to kind of surf the waves of all what we're experiencing. Yes, Louis.
Are there any karmas that arise that are not of your creation? Like your consciousness coming into being for the first time?
Well, your consciousness coming into being for the first time, you mean in this life or because consciousness doesn't come into, we often talk about it being beginningless. So there's no initial moment of consciousness, which is mind-blowing for most of us, right? Because we grew up in a culture where we like to say everything started here. That's why there's a big faith in creator and creation myths, right? And creator gods is everything starts from that moment. In Buddhism, we say there's no beginning to mind. Mind has always arisen from another moment to mind, and mind will always give rise to a subsequent moment to mind. So that one doesn't work as an example. But going back to your question, are there karmas that we haven't created, right, that we experience? Well, I mean, certainly there are things we're more distant to in our world, but they say if there is something that we are experiencing that is a part of our experience, has an impact on us and so on, inducing some feelings and some sensations in us, because that's essentially what karma does. Karma produces a result, which is a feeling. We're going to talk about feeling later. Feeling doesn't mean the whole range of things it does in Western psychology. Feeling just means a registration of either something being pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. So say we have the experience of a huge storm that happens that causes us to lose power in Taos County or whatever, and suddenly everyone's having to deal with the suffering of the cold from not having the power to be able to keep your homes warm in the winter or whatever. Because you're being impacted by that, it said that you did create the karma for that. If it happens in Santa Fe, and you hear about it, maybe you're a little saddened, those poor people in Santa Fe, they had to deal with this, coming through and ceasing their power. Well, then you're not really creating the karma for that. It's in your world, it's in your view of experience, but it's not something that's directly impacting you. It's not inducing one of those feelings of kind of pleasure, neutral, or unpleasantness. So essentially, anytime karma ripens, it is something we created. That's the general rule. It's something you created at some moment in time in the past that has now come home to roost. It is now the causes and conditions have come together for that to have an impact on. Which again is very hard for us to hear because it sounds incredibly complex and sounds like, who's keeping track of all this stuff? Nobody's keeping track of all of it. It's all mental energy. And because there's a continuity of mind, that mental energy carries forward. Mental energy we put into things now through wholesome, positive thoughts create their own seeds that ripen into positive things in the future. The negative things we do ripen into negative experiences in the future. But in the meantime, yeah, we are experiencing the whole wave of things that we created in the past that come into our lives that touch us and cause us to have these feelings, have these experiences. We're going to get into this a little bit more next week. Next week, I'm hoping we'll get into these sort of 5 really basic functioning things within our mind. And one of them is this factor of feeling. And once more, we're not talking about a whole range of emotions. We're talking about simply at any moment in time, we are having some sort of feeling tone, some sensation that we're experiencing, even if it's neutral. Go from neutral to positive, pleasant to unpleasant, back and forth all over. But to your question, it is said that everything is a product of our in that regard, if we're experiencing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Yeah.
So
Yes, Anne Marie, one more, and then we should wrap things
this
up.
is a scientific look at it.
Uh-huh.
The idea is that, as our population, back when a Buddha was born, there weren't that many people.
Sure.
And then more and more people started populating the earth,
Mm-hmm.
which means more and more minds were there. And I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to present to you,
Mm-hmm.
that the fact is there can be somebody born today
Uh-huh.
that doesn't have a history of karma, that there are new mind
Uh-huh.
that is in our life.
Right.
So is there any talk about that?
Well, I think that kind of dovetails with Louis' question in terms of when he said about mind, when mind first comes into existence.
Yeah.
Buddhism doesn't hold that happens. There are no new sentient beings in the sense of a new continuum of consciousness, because that would entail an initial moment. And there's nothing. I mean, I don't want to go too deep into this because we could be talking about this all night. But the idea is that when we talk about karma, we're talking about it being a subset of cause and effect. Let's leave mind alone for the moment. Look at the physical world. Joni Mitchell saying we are stardust, right? Because that's the truth, right? The physical components of who we are and everything in this world is stardust. It came from stars exploding that collected and amassed into the planet that we live on, and all of that kind of contained and transforming, the conservation of matter and energy and so on, all the great theories that have come out of science. In the material world, we see that nothing ever is wasted or gone, and nothing arises from nothing. You can't have a world system arising from nothing, right? It has to come from something else. That's why when His Holiness talks with scientists and they say, oh, well, there's the Big Bang, that's when everything started. He says, no, I have no problem with the Big Bang, but there's something before that. There has to be something from which all of that came into existence. And so if that's what's happening in the physical world, there always needs to be something you point to and say, oh, this came about because that was there. Well, then it's the same for consciousness. And that's just a premise we have to start with. I can't prove to you that mind is clear, non-material, and so on. But we're going to use that as a premise for this whole idea of what we're working with. And it's a relief to some degree. I mean, I'm really glad that there's rebirth, because I don't think in this single lifetime I can do all the work that's necessary for me to get to Buddhahood. It's nice that you can, that's possible, they say, but it's not as likely perhaps. So my mind goes on. I have another chance. I have another chance after that. I can do this for as long as I need to. Now, obviously, I want to do it more quickly because I want to help other beings. I want them to benefit from me being a Buddha. But mind has that continuity. So it's just a thought to maybe play with over the next week and think about, if that's so with the material world, which I think most scientists would agree to. I don't know what happens when His Holiness challenges them with this idea of something before the Big Bang. But the idea is that then, if that's happening there, then perhaps it's happening with consciousness. Let's do our dedication prayers. We got a dedication list, I'm sorry, that we need to go to first. Mary Jo, your question, did you want to add something to the list? Is that, you need to unmute. Unmute, please, Mary Jo. Oh, you're still muted.
I'm sorry to hold us
There
up,
we go.
but this is a very mundane question. But did any of this literature for us to read get printed by anybody? Do you know?
Um, John has printed out just the reading list and a chart that I'm going to be referring to starting next week.
Okay, that was
Again, you can download it from the drive that I sent to you, as well as from the book that I've been referring to and showing passages from. You can download that as a PDF file and read it on a tablet or a computer. If you want it printed out, it's a rather long book, so
exactly.
yeah, probably
I'll
100 and some pages, almost 200.
and see if I can understand it better and how to get to it. Yes, that will be fine. Thank
I
you.
think it was, again, sent out with the email last week, but I'm going to have John also maybe send out this drive. Let me just show you
It's
this.
also on our website, the link to.
Yeah, the link's on the website.
Okay, the link's on the website,
Of
great.
this.
So you should be able to go here and you'll see that there's some handouts. There's the chart that John has some copies of there. I'm going to put in here my presentation slides from tonight, so you have those, and I'll be adding those each week. And then the text, there's these other texts here. The main one is this one I just had on there, The World and Ourselves, 2016. Oh, it wasn't as old as I thought. Anyway, this is the text by Venerable Gyatso that I mentioned earlier and read from. All right.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Sure. All right. Jana, please, if you could read the dedication list. Sorry, we're keeping folks here a little bit later tonight.
We dedicate the merit created from listening to this teaching to all beings everywhere on every prayer list. We dedicate for the health and long life of all our teachers. We dedicate for all those experiencing obstacles, specifically Wyatt, Adrian, Stella, Jana, Marie, Tony, Mary Jo, Rolf, Elohim, Aiden, and Ed Galuski. For all those beings experiencing illness, specifically Jane, Stella, Mary Jo, Maria, Libby S. Lou, Bonte P, Kelly, John, Nikki, Cecil, Bill, and John. Also those beings who are dying or who have died in the last 49 days, Renee Good, Sandra Jackson, Eric, Nate Selby, Alex Pretty, and the skunk.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jana. And any other beings we're holding in our hearts, we include in those thoughts of dedicating for their welfare, their freedom from suffering, and to find the causes of happiness. Let's do a few more dedication prayers. I think we'll just do these first two, and then I'll just do some thoughts of dedication after that.
Dedication prayers once in English tonight. Due to the merits of these virtue sections, may we quickly attain the state of Guru Buddha, and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel of bodhicitta that has not arisen or arisen grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more.
So we usually do a long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We can simply generate those thoughts that he be in this world for as long as possible to benefit us and all beings. And also for the reincarnation of Lama Zopa Rinpoche to happen as smoothly as possible, for that reincarnation to be found and for everything to be auspicious, for that being to be of great benefit to all sentient beings. Okay, thank you all. So again, for the next week or so, maybe you can think about some of the concepts you've heard tonight and meditate on them a bit and see, how they resonate with you. And begin to have that kind of paying attention to everything that you experience is a product of what you did in the past. How you relate to that and respond to that is going to affect what you experience in the future. And just to introduce that thought, maybe it doesn't change what you do in the moment at this point, but just to have that thought is great. It's progress, right? Be aware that that's what's going on. Okay, everyone be well and stay safe, stay sane. And I'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you,
You're
Don.
very welcome. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You do have some thoughtful question.
What's that?
I said, you do have some thoughtful question.
Thank you for that saying that.
I look tired, don't I?